What's up, everyone? Welcome to Stat Chasing following the week one set of games heading into week two. My name is Sam Hoppen, and I'll be taking over Stat Chasing this year for Pat Crane, who had done it in the past. If you haven't watched the show before, this is where I'll be going through some of the key stats that I think are important to help lay a foundation for understanding what happened this past week that can help inform decisions going forward into the next week. So before we get into the details, want to talk through just some of the stats that I'll be walking through today. We've got some from PFF, which include routes data, so the number of routes run, the percent of routes run on team dropbacks. We also have targets per route run and yards per route run, and then expected fantasy points, which is coming from PFF this year as well. I also have a bunch of data from the NFL play-by-play data that I've accumulated through NFL Faster online, which includes air yards, which is simply the distance that the ball traveled in the air before it got to a receiver on a targeted pass. We also have Whopper, which is weighted opportunity rating, which is was popularized by Josh Hermsmeyer, which is a stat that weights air yard share and target market share. Also have quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is simply yards per attempt for quarterbacks, but it weights it with interceptions and touchdowns, giving bonuses for touchdowns and negatives for interceptions. And then we have a couple of stats that have been popularized by Ben Gretsch, which include weighted targets per route run, which is similar to Whopper in that it weights air yards and the routes run with a general scalar included. And then high value touches, which is a running back specific metric which counts carries inside the 10-yard line and receptions for those running backs. So my plan is to go through stats position by position so that I can compare against others within the position, help you make some start, sit, waiver, or trade decisions in your league. And then I'll go more in depth through some team situations at the end that stood out to me and some of the other members of the Discord. Speaking of, a quick reminder to subscribe to the YouTube channel and become a member for just $5 a month to get early access to the show, access to the Discord, and a couple other benefits as well. And one quick shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who once again will be adding timestamps to the YouTube for each of the positions and team conversations. So looking forward to having that. But why don't we get right into it? I'm going to start off with the quarterback position, and you can see on the chart that I have displayed, I'm going to be talking through some of the stuff on these charts, but hoping to make it as easily digestible for the listeners as well, who are just listening through the podcast form. But on the chart, you have adjusted yards per attempt, what I mentioned before, on the x-axis, and the touchdown rate on the y-axis. And the size of the bubble is rushing yards. Wanted to incorporate some sort of part of the rushing production that quarterbacks are having. So today, not going to spend a ton of time on quarterback because I don't think that much changed in the quarterback landscape this week, but there were a couple of notable performances that stood out. One was Tyrod Taylor, who rushed for 41 yards. On top of that, had nearly 300 passing yards, and he had a solid 9.6 average depth of target. So he's not just dinking and dunking, which will benefit the receivers that he's passing to. And I think if that continues, he'll have some usable weeks. If you think about 40 rushing yards as equivalent to one passing touchdown in the 4 point per passing touchdown leagues, that's just an extra touchdown that he's throwing, which is huge. And he doesn't stand out dramatically on this chart that I'm showing, but is above the median in both of the categories, which is signified by the black dotted line on each of the axes. Another guy that has been under the radar, and rightfully so, wasn't drafted in a ton of leagues, but Jared Goff had a solid fantasy day with nearly 30 fantasy points. He threw for over 300 passing yards. He had 340 air yards, which was top 10 on the week. And I could really see him having a Jameis Winston 2019 type season where he's actually getting there and having a solid season on volume over efficiency. In some of the offseason strategy articles that I did with TJ Hernandez over at 4for4, we looked at what had correlated with quarterback fantasy production on a game-by-game level, and it was all the efficiency metrics that really stood out. The volume type stuff that you see with pass attempts and passing yards were not as predictive of a metric, but I think Jared Goff is certainly one of those players who can make up for the lack of efficiency on the just bulk number of times that he's going to be throwing, that the Lions will be throwing. They were obviously down pretty big early on, which helped him have a solid day in the last couple minutes. One of the guys that has always been super efficient passing the ball and continues to be is Russell Wilson. He continued his absurd efficiency with a 17% touchdown rate. He had the third highest average depth of target this week. And for now, the Seahawks with week 1, they had a pass rate over expected of about 4%. And pass rate over expected, it looks at where on the field, the time left in the game, a bunch of factors that determine whether a play would be expected or not expected to be a pass. And then if a team throws more times than expected, then their pass rate over expected is above 0. And if not, it's below 0. And I'll talk about one of those guys in a minute. But I don't think that the Seahawks need to lead the league in pass rate or pass rate over expected for Wilson to have a huge season, because again, he is so efficient. He's got the deep threats in Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf that are going to stretch the field for him, that are going to catch those nice lofty deep balls that he throws. So I expect him to continue to be a top 6-ish option for the quarterback position going forward. And you got to be feeling good about yourself if you did take Wilson this year. On the flip side, and wrapping up the quarterback position here, was Matt Ryan. He was pretty abysmal this week. He was one of 4 starting quarterbacks to throw for fewer than 200 yards, and his adjusted yards per attempt was third lowest on the day at 4.7. I don't really know what was going on with the Falcons. They just seemed unprepared. Arthur Smith said after the game that they just didn't prepare well enough and didn't execute as well. They had the third lowest pass rate over expectation at right around negative 10%. So they threw the ball on 10% fewer plays than you would expect. This doesn't really make sense given that they were trailing for most of the game. The Eagles had a pretty big lead from right out the gate. I wonder if this is the Arthur Smith sort of ground and pound influence that he's taking from Tennessee when he had Derrick Henry, but he certainly doesn't have that Derrick Henry-esque guy anymore. And you would think with the, I guess, kind of investment that they made in the passing attack with Kyle Pitts, they obviously let Julio Jones go, but you would think that they would be passing more, and especially with how poor their defense is and is expected to be, hopefully that pass rate jumps up in the coming weeks here and we get some more fruitful opportunities from the Falcons passing attack. So that's all I'm going to talk about. Quarterbacks for now, some of the team specific situations. I'll talk about a couple other quarterbacks, but going to move on to the running back position. And I flipped over the chart on the screen here, and we've got receiving expected points on the x-axis and rushing expected points on the x-axis and receiving expected points on the y-axis with fantasy points over expectation, which is I'll shorten to FPO as the size of the bubble. So if a player scored more fantasy points than he would expect to based on, again, where they were on the field when they got their opportunities, then the bubble will obviously be bigger. And the first person I'm going to talk about is Austin Ekeler, who was a big beneficiary of some rushing expected fantasy points. There were a lot of eyes on the Chargers. I know I was watching Red Zone when they flipped to the Chargers. They were, I think, at the 3-yard line, and everyone was wondering what the Chargers were going to do. They ended up giving that first goal line carry to Austin Ekeler. He scored a touchdown, and it was all good news from there. But he had another carry inside the 5 later in the game and had a total of 4 green zone touches. And a green zone touch is any rushing attempt within the opponent's 10-yard line. So a little bit closer than the red zone. And he only had 2 carries inside the 5 in his 9 games last year, then went out and recorded 2 this week. So that sort of answers is Austin Ekeler a goal line threat question. Now, whether Larry Roundtree or Justin Jackson see some of those in the future is an open question, but I think it's certainly encouraging to see that he is getting those opportunities right out of the gate. The concern with Ekeler is that he didn't get a single target, which is the first time that that's happened for him since week 10 of 2018. Herbert threw it 47 times. So there's some cause for concern, but he did run a route on just over half of Herbert's dropbacks. So that's the silver lining if you're looking for one. And again, I think if he continues to get the goal line work and he increases those targets, then he could have a Christian McCaffrey type year with the way that we expect that offense to play. Moving on, one of the big storylines on Sunday had to do with the 49ers running backs. Trey Sermon was a surprise inactive early on Sunday morning. And then, so the 49ers rolled in with Raheem Mostert, Elijah Mitchell, and JaMycal Hasty as their 3 running backs. Mostert ended up getting hurt early in the first half, and Elijah Mitchell and Hasty were sort of given the reins throughout the rest of the game. Elijah Mitchell is obviously being talked about as one of the bigger waiver ads this week. I'm not totally sold on him as being an all-in type guy, spending all of your budget on him because, well, one, we got some news before I started recording this that the 49ers signed Kerryon Johnson to their practice squad. The 49ers have already announced that Trey Sermon will be active this week. And the 49ers running backs on Sunday had only 2 high-value touches despite scoring 41 points, which is not what you want to see. It was last in the league this week. And this backfield is going to be a bit of a timeshare as long as Kyle Shanahan is the head coach there. Mitchell didn't record a single target, but he had about 10 rushing expected points on the day from 19 carries, which is great to see. And I think the rushing is really where he's going to get his value from anyway if he can separate himself. At this point, I think Kerryon Johnson has sort of typecast himself as a little bit of a passing downs back. So if Mitchell can supersede Trey Sermon on the depth chart, which it's already looked like he has, and be the primary rushing back, then that's certainly going to help his case. Dwayne McFarland from PFF actually noted that Hasty played on all of the long down and distance and the 2-minute offensive snaps. So it seems like he is the preferred pass catching back right now, but we'll see how and if Kerryon Johnson gets mixed in there, as well as Trey Sermon. Another positive sign, I think, for the 49ers backs is that they had a pass rate under expectation of about 15 percentage points. So they were 15 percentage points under expectation in the red zone specifically. And obviously Trey Lance had that beautiful passing touchdown to Trent Sherfield when they got in close, and he might take away some more goal line opportunities when the 49ers get close to the goal line, when hopefully he ends up starting. But there's been a lot of research that obviously rushing quarterbacks provide more efficiency for their running backs. So hopefully it sort of balances itself out that way. Next up, the next situation also came from a surprise inactive with Zach Moss of the Bills being inactive for the game against the Steelers. And we got a chance to see what would happen if the Bills chose to go with just one guy. There was a lot of debate this offseason as to Moss or Singletary, them it being a split backfield. And Devin Singletary ended up playing on 75% of snaps and ran a route on 66% of dropbacks. He was above average, as you can see on the chart here, in both rushing EP at around 7 and receiving EP at around 6. So certainly took advantage of the role he got. He handled 16 of the 20 running back opportunities for the Bills and had a solid 4 high value touches as well. Matt Breida was the only other guy really in the backfield, and he only played on 12% of snaps. So this was about as close to bell cow level workload that we've seen from the Bills in the last year. And there were 4 games that we saw from the Bills last year that a running back got at least 5 targets. And Devin Singletary was the guy every single time, every Singletary time. So he's clearly the pass catching option if there is one, which is great because Buffalo had a massive pass rate in this game. I think threw the ball over 50 times and had a positive pass rate over expectation. They picked up right where they left off, continuing to throw the ball as much as possible. And we'll see if Moss is active next week and how that shakes things up. I might be talking about that situation again next week. The Lions running backs obviously pop quite a bit on this chart here. You see DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams both near the top of the chart, specifically for the receiving fantasy expected points. They both scored over 20 fantasy points in PPR. Each of them were targeted at least 9 times and had exactly 20 opportunities apiece. They both had 9 high-value touches, which is just outstanding. I mean, that's a Christian McCaffrey level of high-value touches that they're seeing. And where there's a differentiation between the two was in the snap counts. Swift played 68% of the snaps, while Williams played only 35% of snaps. So Swift was in on about twice as many snaps. And it was great to see Swift not limited by the groin injury or anything else really. And we saw a similar split on routes as a percent of dropbacks, with Swift running at a 65% clip, while Williams was at a 32% rate. So I think at this point, both of them are probably startable because, like I mentioned with Jared Goff earlier, they'll be in a lot of pass-happy game scripts. And if they're targeting the running backs this much, then they both stand to benefit. It's great that Swift seems to be the clear guy, and hopefully as the season moves on and he gets a little bit more rest and the groin injury heals fully, that he'll have more rushing opportunities as well. The next situation is actually pretty similar, and it's with the Eagles running backs. Boston Scott at this point is a clear drop. He does not need to be on any teams. He only played snaps on special teams, didn't have a single offensive snap. He is someone to keep an eye on because he'll be the next man up if Kenny Gainwell, the rookie, gets hurt. But Gainwell was actually the one who got the lone green zone touch for the Eagles. But like I said, the Eagles had a similar split to what the Lions running backs had, as Miles Sanders had a 66% snap share while Gainwell only had a 35% snap share. This was seen in the opportunity counts as well. Sanders had 20 opportunities to Gainwell's 12, but Sanders only had one more high-value touch than Gainwell had. Sanders had 4 and Gainwell had 3. And I think one of the bigger takeaways with this backfield is that the 8 running back targets between the two is very encouraging. A lot of people don't think that rushing quarterbacks like Jalen Hurts pass to their running backs because they will see the option to run before dumping it off to the running backs. But this was certainly a step in the right direction for those two guys. And to see it condensed between the two of them was really nice, because it gives us some clear indication of being able to drop Boston Scott and focus on, just those two backs. Where things stayed a little bit messy is with the New York Jets running backs. We've got Ty Johnson, Michael Carter, the rookie, and Tevin Coleman back there for the Jets. Ty Johnson led the 3 backs in snap percentage at 54%, and total fantasy expected points, though it was only around 6 total fantasy expected points. And Carter and Coleman each had about a 25% snap share. Coleman did not record a single target, and Carter and Johnson each recorded a single high-value touch with their lone receptions, but nobody had a green zone touch. That's probably one of the main concerns with this backfield, is how often they'll be able to get into the red zone and get into the green zone to give the running backs those opportunities. If I'm inclined to drop one, and Pat, Pete, Eric Belair, and I have both Ty Johnson and Coleman on our main event team that we drafted on Friday, I think I'd probably drop Coleman. I think that Ty Johnson has a better chance of potentially increasing his rushing workload than Coleman does of increasing his receiving work. And I think there's a chance that later in the season, Michael Carter gets more rushing opportunities as well, and hopefully takes over that role from Tevin Coleman. But if you're really strapped for bench depth, you could probably drop any of these guys. I mean, Michael Carter is probably a speculative hold at this point, but there might not be a lot of fantasy value in this backfield. A couple other just sort of running back quick hitters here. Ezekiel Elliott, and this is from Ben Gretsch in his Stealing Signals column. He pointed out that Ezekiel Elliott ran a route on 71% of the Cowboys dropbacks, while Tony Pollard was out there for only 21%. But Pollard ended up getting more targets, and he out-targeted Zeke 4-2. It still seems like Zeke is the featured guy. Zeke is probably a buy low opportunity at this point where you can get it. I know Mike McCarthy during the game on Thursday night pointed out that they were really just taking what the defense was giving to them. The Buccaneers were one of the best rushing defenses last year, and that showed again on Thursday night. So I think better days are ahead for Zeke and probably Pollard as well. By now, you've probably heard that Najee Harris played on 100% of the team's snaps, so went right into a full bell cow role. He had 12.5 fantasy points under expectations, which is just not very good at all. You can see, or maybe you can't see the little dot on the chart next to his name is extremely small, and that's because he just did not produce. But I think the fact that he had so many expected fantasy points this game and just didn't capitalize on them are a sign of better days to come for him. Christian McCaffrey's back. He scored the most fantasy points this week for among running backs without scoring a single touchdown. He's just a monster. You can see he's on the top right of this chart, which is where he'll probably be all season. I wonder why people got fancy and passed on him at the 101, but they certainly did. From a couple of backfields in the AFC South, Jack Miller from NBC Sports Edge and ETR pointed out that James Robinson got just 35.7% of the Jaguars running back carries on Sunday after handling an absurd 85% of them in 2020. So that's a 50% drop in his running back carry share. He did outsnap Carlos Hyde, 64% for Robinson to 34% for Hyde, and ran more routes. He doubled Carlos Hyde by in routes run, and Robinson also got both of the goal line snaps, which ended up being pass plays. So James Robinson seems like he's the overall guy, but Carlos Hyde's going to be a thorn in Robinson's side all season from a fantasy perspective. Mark Ingram led all running backs in rushing expected fantasy points this week with about 21 points, but the Texans were just in such a favorable game script pretty much all game against the Jaguars, and he didn't get much receiving work. Phillip Lindsay did get a couple targets, but it looks like it'll just be those two with some David Johnson mixed in as well. And another series of you love to see it is Jonathan Taylor. He was tied for second among running backs with 9 high-value touches. He had 23 total touches, and where he is on this chart, it's not far off from CMC, which is fantastic. The best part, I think, of this is that Indy was trailing for most of the game too, and Hines got some work as well. He got some receiving work, just about as much as Taylor did, but the fact that Taylor was also able to succeed, Marlon Mack was sparingly used, and that's all I've got for running back. So let's dive into the wide receivers. And you see Tyreek Hill and Deebo Samuel, which is kind of crazy up in the top right. But on the chart here, we have weighted targets per route run on the x-axis, like I mentioned, and then air yards market share on the y-axis with FPO as the size of the bubble. And I'm planning on talking about the wide receivers in terms of wide receiver groups. We'll just sort of talk about the wide receiver core because, again, we want to compare, hopefully determine how to distinguish between some of the messy wide receiver groups and then highlight some individual players at the end. But I'll start off with the Bills wide receivers. I talked about the running backs before, but let's focus on the pass catchers now. I'm not worried at all about Stephon Diggs. He was targeted 14 times in the game. He came away with 9 catches overall. He had 150 air yards as well, which is great to see, sort of the deep threat aspect of his game coming up. He had only topped 150 air yards twice in the regular season last year. And the other guy that seemed to play a deep threat role, which was Emmanuel Sanders, which I don't think a lot of people expected. He had an average depth of target of 18.6 yards, and both him and Cole Beasley ran on over 90% of the Bills dropbacks. That, like I said, the Bills are as pass happy as ever, which is good. It's just a matter of being able to complete those passes for Diggs and execute on them. Gabriel Davis, the guy who I think a lot of people expected to be the deep threat, ended up finding the end zone in the game, but he's clearly the number 4 option behind Diggs, Beasley, and Sanders. Another passing attack that I'm not as confident in is the Jets wide receivers. Elijah Moore and Corey Davis were really the 2 big factors in this. Jamison Crowder did not play in the game, so that's relevant. And I think a lot of people were excited about Elijah Moore. I know he was very popular in DFS, but ended up with -3 yards, which is not great. He did get a couple deep shots. He finished with 92 air yards, which was second on the team, but he couldn't turn that into any production at all. He was second on the team in routes run with 39, so he was just behind Corey Davis's team leading 40 routes run, which is good for an 84% route run percentage for Elijah Moore. And the good thing is that I'm not convinced that Moore is just going to be phased out and replaced by Crowder when Crowder does get back. It sounds like the Jets are pretty confident that Crowder will be back this week, but Elijah Moore had a 23-yard average depth of target and had 25% of the air yard share. He's not showing up on the chart here because I have a minimum set at 5 targets, but might change that down next week to include some guys like Elijah Moore who only saw 4 targets. But if Moore is able to convert on those deep passes, then he'll certainly have a great rookie season. And until Crowder returns, Moore and Davis are probably the only 2 fantasy relevant wide receivers on this team. And Zach Wilson played okay, but you certainly might have some better options at wide receiver. Another rookie wide receiver was Devontae Smith. I'll talk about the Eagles wide receivers here for a minute. Devontae Smith looks like he's the wide receiver 1. He led the team with 7 targets on the day. He also led the team with a 0.44 weighted targets per route run, which is not great compared to the rest of the league. As you can see here, he's on the top left quadrant all by his lonesome, but he got a solid air yard share of about 50%, which is absolutely fantastic. Behind him, Jalen Reagor and Quez Watkins were the only other two Philly wide receivers to actually run a route in the game. And Smith was the lone deep threat. Like I mentioned, he had 56 air yards on the day, and Reagor and Quez Watkins finished with 6 and -7 air yards each. They're obviously going to still compete with the 2 tight ends, Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz, but this could be a fairly condensed passing attack for the receivers, which I don't think a ton of people expect the Eagles to be super pass happy again, especially with Jalen Hurts under center. But if it is just these 3 wide receivers and nobody else, then I feel really good about Devontae Smith and think he could have just a fantastic first season in the league. Quez Watkins does seem to be the slot guy right now. He ran 68% of his routes out of the slot. The other 2 receivers, Smith and Reagor, both lined up pretty much on the outside. And this could be a fun team. They obviously played the Falcons week 1, which does not have a great defense, but I'm encouraged by what I saw. And with Smith and Reagor both finding the end zone was certainly a great cap to their day as well. As far as another team that people don't expect to be throwing that much is the Browns, and their wide receivers, Anthony Schwartz, Jarvis Landry, and Donovan Peoples-Jones, were the only 3 receivers to run a route for Cleveland. Odell Beckham Jr. was ruled out. I think a lot of people expected Peoples-Jones to take over that role, lining up outside for the afternoon, but it was Anthony Schwartz who stole the show. He had a 1.1 weighted targets per route run, which was 3rd in the league yesterday. You see him popping off on the far right side of the chart, had positive FPO and was top 10 in air yards market share yesterday as well at 47%. But this might be a bit of a flash in the pan type scenario when, depending on when Odell Beckham Jr. returns to the lineup, because Peoples-Jones ran 26 routes, which was only 1 fewer than Jarvis Landry and 9 more than Schwartz did. So it'll be interesting. I think PFF is working on putting together a personnel adjusted yards per route run metric for this season. If you don't remember, Hayden Winks of Underdog did some work this offseason looking at the difference between different personnel groupings and how yards per route run changed based on 2 and 3 wide receiver sets. So this is the Cleveland offense is one that I don't expect to have a lot of 4 wide receiver sets. Obviously, like I said, they only had 3 receivers running a route all game, but I'd still hold on to Donovan Peoples-Jones. I'd add Schwartz if you're desperate for some wide receiver depth, but Cleveland's red zone pass rate over expectation was the lowest in the league this week at negative 30%. So it seems like they're just going to pound it in with Hunt and Chubb when they get in close, or they might bring a couple extra tight ends, and I'll talk about the Browns tight ends here in a minute. But it's one of those teams where I think there's probably only room for 2 receivers at the top, whether it's Landry and Beckham or Landry and Peoples-Jones or someone like that. But I think Jarvis Landry, despite not having a fantastic day, he didn't have a lot of air yards, I think remains one of the better options on that team. Moving on to just some final things for wide receivers to wrap up. The Pittsburgh Steelers, Juju ran a route on every drop back for the Steelers, which was great. Deontay Johnson ended up missing a couple snaps due to injury, but Chase Claypool did not run as many routes as either of them. The interesting thing, and we saw this a little bit last year, was that Chase Claypool was the only Pittsburgh wide receiver with an ADOT over 10 yards, and he was at 12.2 yards. The other 2 primary guys in Juju and Johnson were at 6.3 and 5.1 yards, respectively, for their ADOT. So they're not getting the deep targets. If they'll probably see more targets than Claypool over the course of the year, but Claypool is certainly more likely to have a big scoring play. Claypool also got a rushing attempt when they were getting kind of close to the end zone. I think they were in the red zone at the time, so he has that part of his game as well. DJ Moore, a ship-chasing fan favorite, had an average depth of target of 11.4 yards on Sunday, and that's down almost 2 yards from his 13.2 average depth of target last year. He made some fantastic catches, just didn't get into the end zone, which is sort of the story of his career at this point. Robbie Anderson had a 30-yard average depth of target. He only had 3 targets, but you sort of saw flashes of that Darnold to Anderson connection that we had seen a couple years ago in New York with the 2 of them. They connected on a long touchdown pass in the game as well. Excuse me. And it'll be interesting to see as we get more reps and games and to see how those roles play out. Terrace Marshall had a solid game as well, but those three seem to be the top options in the passing game along with CMC. Calvin Ridley had 3 catches and 3 targets on the first drive of the game for the Falcons. I was really excited for him to be the focal point, and then he only got 5 targets and 2 catches for the rest of the game, which was not great. He just sort of disappeared. And again, I'm hoping that this game for the Falcons was more of a fluke than anything, and they just used this week to adjust. But Ridley had a whopper of 0.7, which was top 10 on the week. So that's encouraging. I think as we get further along in the season, we could see Ridley's air yards creep up and hopefully be leading the league in those eventually. Going back to Thursday night, there's obviously the news that Michael Gallup is going to be out for 3 to 5 more weeks with a calf strain. Lamb will probably be the biggest beneficiary outside of Cedric Wilson, who was the only other Dallas wide receiver to run a route between those three and Amari Cooper. But Lamb had only run a route on 76% of dropbacks on Thursday, while Amari Cooper was at 94%. It was interesting because in a lot of the 2 wide receiver sets that Dallas was running, it was Cooper and Gallup on the outside. This was before Gallup got hurt. And then they had Schultz and Jarwin running a 2 tight end set. So hopefully Lamb can get in on those 2 wide receiver sets, because it's obviously easier to command targets. He had 15 targets in this game, which is amazing. His ceiling is still there because he didn't even catch all of them. I think he dropped an end zone target as well, but he had an astounding 0.84 weighted targets per route run and a 0.69 whopper. So he didn't have the biggest game by any means, but he had a really good game, and there's more for him to grow. And then finally, this also from Jack Miller, Brandon Ayuk was a no-show on Sunday, but he played almost half the snaps in week 1, and Trent Sherfield, the guy who scored the touchdown on the Trey Lance pass, only played 1 more snap than Ayuk and only had 3 targets. So, I mean, Ayuk ran 1 more route than Sherfield. I don't know what this is. This is probably the fact that they got up so big and they didn't really need to push him. I think that Deebo Samuel is in a great place. He played nearly every snap. He recorded 12 targets. He had I think he had 100 air yards as well, which was the most in his career. So if he somehow holds that role, then he is going to be one of the biggest draft values this season, because he was consistently going behind Ayuk. But they play the Eagles this upcoming week, so we'll see what happens there. Going to move on to the tight end position now. I have the same chart for tight ends as wide receivers, with weighted targets per out run on the x-axis and the air yards market share on the y-axis, with FPO as the size of the bubble. There's not a lot, I think, new here. Darren Waller and Mark Andrews, you see on the chart, don't have a bubble. That's because I wasn't able to get the fantasy points over expectation numbers for them since they played on Monday night, but you can see generally where they are with where their names are. But this week, the good guys played like you would have expected. George Kittle did not have quite as big of a game, but again, he'll find his way to having his big games. As far as a couple situations, like I said, I wanted to talk about the Browns tight ends, and similar to Calvin Ridley, Austin Hooper had 3 targets and 3 receptions on the first drive and then was not targeted again. David Njoku actually out-targeted Hooper 5-3, but they each ran routes on fewer than 60% of 60% of the team snaps. And I don't think either of these guys are particularly fantasy relevant, but it might be one of those situations where if one goes down, then another one gets an increased opportunity. But they also have Harrison Bryant as well, who would likely step in. I think if you're looking for a deep league ad or an ad for a tight end premium, someone to stash, James O'Shaughnessy he's a tight end for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and he might be sort of a sneaky ad this week. He ran a route on nearly 80% of the Jaguars snaps this week and recorded 8 targets, which was 4th on the team. There were 3 of the receivers had at least 9 targets, but I mean, again, like he's getting targets. The Jaguars are going to be passing a ton, and he seems like he's the only tight end option in that offense. So again, this is as bad as the tight end landscape is. There are certainly worse options to be looking at. For those of you concerned about Kyle Pitts, he did record 8 targets. He was tied for the most on the team and ran a route on 90% of dropbacks. You can see here he had the 3rd highest air yards market share, and he was lined up in the slot or out wide on 80% of his snaps. So if you're looking for the tight end who's actually a wide receiver, he's definitely that guy. And finally, it's worth noting, again, you've probably heard this as well, but Tyler Higbee played on 100% of the Rams snaps on Sunday Night Football. He ran a route on 93% of dropbacks, so he's clearly benefiting with Gerald Everett gone in Los Angeles. So to wrap things up, I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about some overall team situations, some that stood out to me, some that a couple people in the Discord wanted me to bring attention to, but the first of which is the Arizona Cardinals. They had a huge game. Kyler Murray had 5 touchdowns. He was everything that you hoped and wished for and just absolutely crushed it against the Tennessee Titans. Starting with the backfield, though, Chase Edmonds had 6 high-value touches to James Conner's 1 high-value touch, but 4 of Edmonds' high-value touches came on his receptions. And I think the way that Edmonds has a solid season is maintaining a role in the passing game, because it seems like Kyler Murray is the goal line option right now. He ran one in from a couple yards out. So Edmonds and Conner might struggle to get those valuable green zone touches as well. I think the big takeaway for the Cardinals receivers is that it's pretty messy behind DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins just absolutely crushed it, had over 15 expected fantasy points. He was 11.4 fantasy points over expected as well. And Ben Gretsch pointed out that Rondale Moore, again, another ship-chasing favorite, ran a route on only 39% of dropbacks, but he was actually more productive than AJ Green. He had 4 catches for 68 yards, while Green had 2 catches for only 25 yards. And AJ Green ran a route on 89% of dropbacks, so more than double what Moore did there. You know, he had a pass in the end zone in the game, and he just had no energy to try and go up and get it. And hopefully Moore gets an opportunity more quickly, but he probably isn't fitting as the outside guy right now. 79% of his snaps were from the slot. And Christian Kirk, who also had a big day, 5 receptions for 70 yards and 2 touchdowns. He played 96% of his snaps in the slot as well. So unfortunately, we might be stuck with AJ Green for a bit. As much as we want to see the Rondale Moore breakout, we might have to hold on for a little bit. I do think he is worth holding on, like I mentioned, and is certainly, hopefully has better days ahead. The next team situation is with the Washington football team, and this one and the next one have to do with some injury questions and the fallout from those. But the big question is, how does the team perform with Tyler Heinicke as the quarterback? Ryan Fitzpatrick got put on IR today, so he could potentially return partway through the season. But for now, it's the Taylor Heinicke show in Washington. And a couple of things to point out here. Kent Wyrock of PFF pointed out that in the wildcard game last year against the Bucs, when Taylor Heinicke started, McLaurin went 6 for 75 on 7 targets, and then for some reason Cam Sims had 13 targets, but only caught seven of them for 104 yards. This past week, all 4 of McLaurin's targets actually came when Heinicke was in the game. So he made a fantastic catch. If you haven't seen it, it was right on the sideline and was just an absolutely beautiful adjusting for the ball. Where I think things change is that when the quarterback switch was made in the game, Washington had only a 44% pass rate on their final 48 plays. Hopefully and excuse Crosby for shaking off and making some noise here. But they had a 44% pass rate on the final 48 plays. Again, for the benefit of this passing attack, hopefully that doesn't hold. But if it does, then Antonio Gibson would benefit massively. He handled 20 of Washington's 23 running back carries. He showed up on the top right quadrant of the running back chart that I showed earlier that we want to see him in. And Gibson's 3 high-value touches were his only 3 catches, but that's probably the other concern, is how often Washington will get close to the goal line. He did get more targets than J.D. McKissic, which is fantastic and encouraging. He had 5, while McKissic only had 1. And Jarrett Patterson was minimally involved. But I think this is actually the perfect time to buy low on these Washington football team players, because a lot of people are going to be scared off by the lack of Ryan Fitzpatrick. But I don't think from a fantasy production standpoint, it really is going to make that big of a difference. And hopefully I'm not eating my words here in a couple of weeks, but Ryan Fitzpatrick is just sort of known for his gunslinging mentality, and that can also be a function of the coaching and how that happens. So I'm still optimistic about the prospect for the football team players and how they play. Diami Brown was great. He didn't get a ton of targets, but he played on over 90% of the snaps. So that's fantastic to see, with Curtis Samuel on short-term IR for now. The next situation is with Denver, the Denver Broncos. The big question here, again, who will step up in Jerry Jeudy's absence? And Jeudy ended up leaving the game in the third quarter, so we didn't get that much of a sample without him. But we need to make moves quickly, so hopefully can do some dissecting here of who are going to be the guys. And he's expected, I think, to be out 6 to 8 weeks, so wouldn't be shocked to see him go on injured reserve. But hopefully you've already been listening to Sean Siegel tout KJ Hamler. He had a 0.69 weighted targets per route run, which was second on the team only to Jerry Jeudy on the day. And he led the team in air yards share with a 29% share. He did drop a deep pass that would have been a touchdown from Teddy Bridgewater, although it wasn't the best pass from Teddy. He certainly could have led Hamler a little bit more. But another massive beneficiary from this is going to be Tim Patrick, who had caught all 4 of his targets before Jeudy left the game and made some really nice catches as well. I still think that Noah Fant, who played over 75% of the snaps, is going to have a solid year. I'm not reading too much into the Albert O stuff, but we'll monitor that throughout the season. As far as the backfield, real quick, Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams actually split the time perfectly even between the two of them. They each got 50% of the snaps, but Williams finished with 14 carries to Melvin Gordon's 11. You see the dot for Melvin Gordon much bigger because he had the long touchdown run towards the end of the game. And I just think Williams will sort of take over that backfield sooner rather than later. To wrap up the day, we'll end on a positive note. I think one of the highlights of the day was Jameis Winston throwing for 5 touchdowns in his first start since 2019, but he only threw for 148 yards. He did it on only 20 pass attempts because they were up so big. They didn't have to throw the ball. And a lot of focus right now on the New Orleans passing attack, obviously, with Michael Thomas out for several weeks, over the next several weeks. Chris Hogan running his wind sprints finally paid off. He scored a TD, and he scored that TD on one of his 4 routes. So don't read anything there. I think Marquez Callaway and maybe Deontay Harris are still the only 2 wide receivers that I'm relatively interested in. As you can see, Marquez Callaway played a lot more than Deontay Harris did. So I think it's probably Callaway in a tier of his own, and then Harris and Chris Hogan, a couple other guys behind them. Callaway ended up leading the team in routes run with 21, but he only had 2 targets. A lot of the focus with the Saints came on their tight ends, and Juwan Johnson got a lot of the attention online because he scored 2 red zone touchdowns. He looked like he used to play basketball. Jameis just threw it up to him, and he jumped up and caught it. He jumped over the defenders. It was pretty insane. But Troutman was one of 6 tight ends this week to have an air yards share over 20%. He actually led the team in targets with 6, but only converted that to 3 receptions. Troutman's 0.57 Whopper was also second among tight ends behind only Darren Waller. So if you're looking to add one of these 2 guys, I'm inclined to lean towards where the target and the air yard share was with Adam Troutman. He was the guy who entered the offseason as the primary tight end, and Juwan Johnson had some steam late to have a role in this offense, but it could just be one of these scenarios where neither of them are really that useful, and Johnson's getting all the touchdowns while Troutman's getting all the targets. So it'll be interesting to see again how that plays out. Hopefully we get some more clarity and information on the New Orleans passing attack in future weeks. But that's all I've got for today. This has been a blast. I'm looking forward to next week already. Please make sure that you subscribe to the Ship Chasing channel, become a member to join the Discord, be able to chat with me and Pete, Pat, and all the other guys and gals as well. I'm super excited to be doing this all for you this season. If you have any questions, feedback, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll see you tomorrow night for the regular weekly Ship Chasing show.